All right, guys, Murph's here, and today I want to talk about this, a Sig P229 chambered in 40 Smith & Wesson. This is our latest in the Friendly Fire series, the series in which I review guns out of my friends' collections in order to remove my personal purchase bias, and then answer the question at the end whether or not I would buy it and what changes I would make. So with that, why don't we go ahead and get into a little bit of history. In 1853, Sig opened its doors with the original intent of producing railroad cars and wagons. However, in the 1860s, they would put in for a bid to contract to be able to produce muzzle-loading firearms for the Swiss government. Now, they would continue to produce firearms for the Swiss government into the 1900s and would also start assimilating other companies, including Sawyer & Sons in Germany, which was a prominent rifle manufacturer. Eventually, they would set their sights upon American shores, and they would establish a factory in Virginia in 1985. From there, they would start producing handguns for the police and civilian market, as well as trying to get some military contracts. Now, we've already done a video covering the Sig P226, which is actually the original, inaugural video for the channel. So if you're interested in that, go ahead and check the link in the description. However, we're not really going to spend a lot of time talking about the Sig P226 as much as the other handgun that Sig put up for military adoption, which was the P228. Now, the P228 would get adopted and would actually be utilized by those who needed a more compact firearm, like different military investigative branches. Now, in the 1990s, the 40 Smith & Wesson cartridge would hit the market, and a lot of manufacturers would be jumping through hoops trying to produce their own handgun chambered in the new cartridge. Glock would actually beat Smith & Wesson to the punch on getting their gun out to market, with Smith & Wesson following shortly after, along with the HK-USP and the Sig P229. Now, something that was identified early on as being an issue with specifically the Smith & Wessons, but Glock was not immune to this as well, was that the 40 Smith & Wesson was a high impulse cartridge which caused premature wear on the frames of these 9mm framed handguns. The HK-USP and the Sig P229 would change this by producing their handguns in 40 Smith & Wesson frames, slightly beefier. Sig would take this a step further by also changing how they built their slides. The Sig P228 was built from a stamped steel slide, which did not stand up to the pressures of 40 Smith & Wesson long-term very well. Here, they would go over to a stainless steel slide. Now, this handgun would become popular with a variety of law enforcement agencies as well as the United States Coast Guard. All right, now this particular handgun is actually a police trade-in, which, guys, if you can come across police trade-ins in relatively good shape, I would 100% implore you to go ahead and pick them up, especially if you're looking for a cheap, good firearm, because most likely they are carried frequently and might have a lot of holster wear, but mechanically they'll be quite sound. You might even get some that still have some life left in the night sights, if they have them. All right, guys, that's history. Why don't we go ahead and get into the features of this particular handgun? Right off the bat, we have a 3.9-inch barrel, which, as we can see here, utilizes a Browning tilting cam action. These sights are actually some aftermarket sights that somebody gave to me that I then gave to my friend. As we can see here, they're almost like suppressor height, which we have a bright orange front sight, which allows you to grab that dot very quickly, which has a center tritium and a blacked out rear with a center tritium as well. You kind of stack these in a kind of figure 8 type configuration. The idea being that you wouldn't necessarily get as confused with a 3-dot sight, where there's some concerns that with like 3-dot tritium in the dark that you might accidentally put your front sight to the left or to the right of the two rear sights, to the 2 dots on the rear sight. I've never really noticed that to be an issue, but I guess with this type of setup, it for sure never will be. Now, this rear sight also has a spacious area in order to be able to push this into, your boot, a belt, a table, whatever, in order to be able to conduct a reload or perhaps clear a malfunction, something along those lines. Now, you'll note that we do not have any forward cocking serrations or light rails or anything like that. This gun is much older than that. We do have some beveling on the muzzle in order to make it easier to reholster this. If you look at our rear slide serrations, you note that they are quite small, and that's actually one of the things that I'm not a big fan of for this particular handgun, because as much as these are quite wide and they do catch your fingers very well, it's not a lot of gripping surface area, which I would prefer to see something a little beefier for that. Now, our trigger system is a double action, single action, which means that the first round is double action, and then the subsequent shots will be in single action until you lower the hammer one way or another. This is interesting because this gun does not have any type of external safety. However, it does have a rebounding hammer, which pretty much means that the only time that the hammer, firing pin, and primer are in alignment is when the trigger makes its final movement. So there is not a time where this hammer is resting up against the firing pin in a non-use type condition. So this is safe to carry with a round in the chamber. Now, when it comes to controls, we do have a decocker mounted right here in the grips, which you can almost function with your firing side thumb. However, right when you get to the bottom, there's a lot of tension that stacks up for like the last quarter of movement, and you do have to kind of break your grip in order to lower the hammer. I personally prefer to utilize my support thumb to lower the hammer. I found that to be much easier. Now, something to keep in mind, guys, decockers are really important on double action, single action guns in order to be able to safely lower the hammer, especially if you don't have some sort of cocked and locked option. Now, some people really like to kind of argue about double action, single action triggers, but I'm not against them purely because I train around a lot of double action revolvers and stuff like that. So already a double action trigger doesn't necessarily bother me. Take that into also some people complain about the single action transition. So for a lot of people, whenever they fire the first round double action, they'll shank the first round low left, and then they might make a mistake and attempt to overcompensate and mess up their first single action trigger pull as well. What I've always found to be the most important thing, especially since I train across a lot of different firearms platforms and all that kind of stuff, is to read your trigger. So smooth pulls, finding that wall and all that kind of stuff, and then breaking the shot instead of kind of slapping or jerking the trigger or anything along those lines. If you're utilizing that fundamental of getting up on the wall and all that kind of stuff, you're going to have less of an issue with any type of trigger transition or even training across different handguns. Now, we do have a slide release located right here above the grip panels. And myself, I run overhand slide racks from Slide Lock Reloads, and that is purely because it works with everything, and I train across a wide variety of handgun platforms. So, you know, the slide releases in different locations, and it's not helpful. It's easier for me to refine it to just overhand rack all the slides that I run. This is actually in a really good location if you're somebody who does prefer to do slide release reloads. Now, is this a slide release or a slide lock? This is not a conversation or an argument that I really engage in because I consider it to be a glass half empty or a glass half full type discussion. Am I pouring the glass or am I drinking out of the glass? If I'm trying to conduct some type of administrative action, it's a slide lock. If I'm trying to conduct a reload and want to use it, it's a slide release. It's whatever it is that you feel is right. I'm not going to tell you one way or the other is better. Now, I will say that this position from a releasing the slide for reload type aspect is fantastic. It's very easy for my firing side thumb to get to. And when I did train slide release reloads, I would prefer to have something that is accessible with my firing side thumb, just like I would want my safety and my magazine release all accessible with the firing side thumb. However, there is an issue with this whenever it is that I'm shooting. This is kind of getting a bit ahead into the shooting dynamic, which is I have to be careful with how I build my grip from my thumb's forward grip in order to make sure that I'm not riding the slide release, because that can wind up being an issue. So what I find is that I often have to wrap this thumb up on the back of my other thumb, keeping it completely off of the frame of the handgun. However, if you put me under any amount of duress, I immediately go back to thumbs alongside the receiver, and I will not get a slide lock on my last round fired. So that is something you kind of have to take into account with this. Now, some people might install, there are like smaller, thinner slide releases that you can install on this, and that would help with that problem if you're looking to fix that. Now, this is also why at one time people were taught to kind of cross their thumbs like this. I'm not a big fan of this. You wind up with a lot more flip over top of your hands whenever it is that you're shooting. The front of our trigger guard is textured, as we can see right here, which is advantageous for anybody who wants to grip the front of their gun. However, this is also angled, which I would bet for most people is going to cause them to jerk their muzzle down whenever it is that they're shooting, so I wouldn't necessarily recommend it. Our trigger, let's go ahead and talk about this. I have always found Sig double action triggers to be quite smooth, and this is no exception. I don't feel a lot of grit until I hit kind of the back of its travel, getting to that wall, feeling that tension, and then the shot breaks. There is quite a bit of stacking right at the end. Now, when it comes to slide cycling and coming onto our single action trigger, the reset is pretty short, and you have a small amount of take up to get right back onto the wall to a fairly crisp break. I have no real issues with this kind of stock trigger, and I'm sure many years and thousands of rounds have kind of helped smooth it out as well. Our magazine release is located here at the heel of the trigger guard, kind of what is considered to be more of the American position. I do appreciate that. Earlier SIGs did utilize a heel type mag release. I do have to adjust my grip slightly in order to get to this mag release, but it's not too big of an issue. It's still pretty easy to get to overall. Our grips, these are kind of the Sig wraparound pebbly type grips. I'm not the biggest fan. They really don't have a lot of traction in the hands. As you can see here, we have Sig Sawyer emblazoned on one side and P229 on the other. Something you have to keep in mind with these grips here, guys, is that the screws do have a tendency to back out, so you might need to come through and make sure they're tight every once in a while. Maybe put like a little drop of super glue on there to keep them in place. Now on our front strap here, we do have some serration, which helps you with kind of control up down, but does nothing for side to side. Like I mentioned before, these are wraparound grips, as you can see there. As far as grip circumference as all that is concerned, this fits nicely in my hand. I have no real complaints with kind of the dynamic of this handgun. You do have this swell here at the top, which kind of rests on top of your grip. And it gives this kind of a high profile, which already SIGs have a tendency to be considered to have a high bore axis. But something that I've noticed about SIGs with their high bore axis is that it seems that they are sprung in such a way to kind of mitigate it as an issue. So normally you would be concerned that something with a high bore axis having so much reciprocating mass moving above kind of the center line of your hand that you would have a very flippy recoil profile to it. However, what I've noticed with SIGs is it seems like the recoil impulse starts, kind of pauses for like a millisecond and then picks back up again, which I think is meant to kind of try to keep the bore more flat during cycling. So I didn't really, it's kind of getting ahead to shooting again, but I didn't really notice it be an issue. Now, as you can see here, our grip has a little bit of a toe on it, which is supposed to help channel your grip. However, what I've generally found is that that causes me to torque the muscle down a little bit whenever I'm shooting. So I try to keep the lower part of my grip pretty loose in order to be able to mitigate that as an issue. Our magazine holds 12 rounds, which is the same capacity as a Sig P226, which makes no sense to me because this is supposed to be the compact handgun, and I don't understand why these two would have the same capacity. A 229 having 12 round capacity makes absolute sense to me. A 226 having 12 round capacity is criminal, in my opinion. They absolutely could have fit more rounds in there. Now, what I find interesting is that the frame of this gun was built in Germany, and the slide of this gun was built in Exeter, New Hampshire, which I've heard of guns built in Exeter, New Hampshire, and I've heard of guns built in Germany, which the German guns generally have more value associated with them. So I've never really, I guess, paid enough attention for guns that were kind of built in both. I find that kind of interesting. Now we do have a lanyard loop located here at the bottom of the gun if you're somebody who has to utilize a lanyard in, you know, the daily scope of their duties and all that kind of stuff. All right, guys, that's features. How does it shoot? All right, so I have a lot of experience shooting 40 Smith & Wesson handguns, so this is not necessarily a surprise and all that kind of stuff. Generally, I characterize 40 Smith & Wesson as snappy, and I would include this handgun in that dynamic. It's definitely a little snappy. Not like, oh, I can't possibly control this or anything along those lines, as much as I just noticed that the gun has a little bit of flip to it. It has maybe more flip than what I would commonly expect out of a 9mm, especially in this same frame. Now, our sights are very quick to pick up, but something you have to keep in mind with these sights is how tall they are. So you do have, especially at the closer distances, a little bit of a height over bore type condition that you have to keep an eye on. And something that I found for this is that kind of came into a lot of things I had to keep in mind all at once. So there was my draw stroke, and then present the firearm, and remember to keep these fingers loose because I do kink against that toe, and then also account for height over bore a little bit as I work a double action trigger. It's kind of a lot of different things to keep in mind all at the same time. Now, of course, I could just go ahead and stop worrying about height over bore and just make sure I'm hitting inside a box, which is pretty easy. But I have a tendency to shoot at very small targets and try to get faster at shooting small targets. So height over bore type thing in order to make sure that I'm shooting groups inside of my 2-inch, 3-inch targets is kind of a big deal. Now, would this be a problem in any type of dynamic use? No, not at all. You'd be able to make A-zone hits with this thing all day long, and I've seen the owner of this handgun do so at competitions quite frequently. So these sights are not problematic as much as it's just something you kind of have to work around. Now, when it came to magazine changes, we do have a little bit of a cutout here in the front, which ideally could be used to strip magazines if you ran into some type of malfunction, which is why I find it funny that people complain about the new Glock Gen 5s for having that toe cut out. Like, why would anyone strip their magazine from the front when Sig's been doing it for 40 years now? But I digress. When it came to magazine changes, I did find it a little bit difficult to hit this mag well. That this is maybe just a little thin, and I often found myself getting hung up on this toe here. So not the biggest fan of that. Now, a lot of that comes down to how it is that I index a magazine, which generally is kind of off the toe, finding it at the toe and then going through there. So maybe that is something that if I trained with this handgun, I would find a better solution for. If I trained longer with this handgun, I would find a better solution for. But overall, I had no real complaints. I had no malfunctions with this handguns. The only malfunctions I had with this handgun was oh my goodness. The only malfunctions I had with this handgun were the ones that I induced. So 100% reliable, no real issues to complain about there. All right, guys, that's shooting. What are my recommendations when it comes to this handgun? Would I recommend this for duty use? In a modern sense, maybe a little bit less so, because we don't have optics mounts, we don't have optics mounts, which I don't necessarily think are like a 100% requirement as much as it might be something that you would consider for a duty type gun. And we don't have light mounts, which is definitely something I would like to consider for a duty type gun. I don't think it's useless as a duty gun as much as I just think it has some limitations that you need to account for whenever it is that you're thinking about utilizing it. I don't think the chambering or the capacity or anything like that holds it back. Having the night sights is a good addition as well. I don't think you would be unarmed using this as a duty gun. It just may not be optimized for that purpose. All right, well, what about as a concealed carry handgun? Now that is an interesting question, because the real question here becomes, is this actually compact? Because this is kind of a big gun. So I have a Sig P229 here to compare it up against, which I do consider to be kind of a compact gun, something fairly comparable to a Glock 19. How do these stack up size-wise? So if I go ahead and align the top of the slides here, kind of difficult because they both have some curves. Can't get mad at curves though. Come on now. We can see that the P229 is a little shorter in the grip. And if we go back of the frame to back of the frame, because the P229 has more of a beaver tail than the Sig does, we can also see that the P229 is just a little shorter, not that much shorter. So it seems like we have kind of a almost Glock 45-esque situation here where we have short slide, long grip. So would this be a good concealed carry option? Well, I can tell you that the owner has carried this concealed in his lifetime. Like he has done that. This has been a concealed carry option for him. I also carry something very similar to this, actually an M11A1 from time to time as a concealed carry option. So you can conceal this. You're just also going to have to kind of be dressed in such a manner that is conducive to it. So maybe a heavy jacket or a, kind of loose button-down shirt or something along those lines in order to properly be able to conceal this. A hoodie would also be a good choice. All right, well, what about as a home defense gun? Now, for my own preferences, I would prefer to see a light rail for a home defense gun so that you can actually identify targets and all that kind of stuff. Having night sights is very nice on a home defense gun as well, so that you can utilize a passive night fighting option. I can tell you that the owner does use this as a home defense gun, and I don't think it's out of place in that respect, as much as perhaps kind of in the same conversation as the duty use. It's maybe not optimized for the purpose. Not in the modern sense, not in competition to a lot of things that are out there on the market. Okay, well, what about as a competition pistol? Well, this might be a time where you're maybe a little rounds limited, but if you are competing in a circuit that has some type of major power factor or something along those lines, that would be very advantageous with this particular handgun. I don't think you would be out of place competing with this gun, especially if you were in more of like outlaw matches or something like that, where you were trying to utilize your concealed carry or duty type pistol for your competition purposes. This would be a perfectly acceptable competition pistol. All right, guys. So here's the question. Would I buy it? And the answer is, at one point, yes. That's actually why I bought an M11A1, was because I was interested in something in this kind of size factor from the Sig lineup. The 229 was, was ever present in different, movies and stuff like that when I was growing up, and I've always kind of had an interest in the 229, so I would absolutely buy one of these, especially a police trade-in. Now, I would maybe be a little more interested in it being chambered in 357 Sig, but just a quick barrel change and spring swap, and you've got a 357 Sig handgun. That's pretty awesome. I don't have a whole lot of complaints with that. All right, so if I would buy this, what changes would I make? Well, I'm kind of torn on these iron sights. I definitely would put night sights on the gun if it didn't already come with them. I commonly say that I would prefer to see a little bit taller sights. So I'm kind of back and forth on these sights a little bit as to whether I would go with a more low profile option or continue with a high profile option like what we see on this now. I can tell you though, I do like the 2-dot arrangement, and I like that bright orange for a fast front sight acquisition. So, you know what, I guess I would stick with these. These sights would be acceptable, but really any night sight is pretty much what it is that I would throw on top of these. All right, so we made that decision. I would go with these night sights. And then, of course, a good holster. What would I use this handgun for? This would be a concealed carry option for me. So it's definitely something on the larger end, maybe where I would start my attempts at concealed carrying on any particular day, seeing how it is that I'm dressed that day can actually support a handgun of this size. But I would have no problem with my life being hinged around this particular handgun. It has performed more than adequately, and they have consistently performed more than adequately for quite some time. Now, do I have some concerns about the need to wrap over my thumb? Yes, but it doesn't stop me from carrying my M11A1, and it wouldn't stop me from carrying this either. All right, guys. I think that pretty much covers my thoughts on this particular subject. I hope you guys found this content interesting, and that's pretty much what I got. Have a good day.